Hey everyone, it's reading time with Pickle. This is part two of basically just documenting my process as I read through this resiliency scale for young adults. As mentioned previously, I guess the bigger picture project here is we are attempting to determine the psychometric quality and soundness of different resilience scales used in peer-reviewed academic research. There is I guess, pretty common or pretty well-known issue rather with the idea or the construct of resilience in academia that different scholars and different academics have different opinions about what resilience is. What does resilience mean? And there are a lot of different tests or quizzes or instruments or measurements or assessments or whatever's out there floating around that purport to measure resilience, but may not be actually designed well enough to be considered both a valid and a reliable instrument, meaning that a lot of these different measures might actually not be measuring resilience when that's what they intend to. So they might be measuring something else, or they might not be consistent in their measurements. So they might get it rightish one time or with one group of individuals or in one point of time, but then for whatever reason, the results may not be consistently accurate or valid. So in the last video in part one, we've kind of read through the background and the literature review of this current study by Sandra Prince Embury titled The Resiliency Scale for Young Adults. Basically, the background and their rationale for developing this resiliency scale. And just a quick summary, their resiliency scale for young adults is an extension of a prior resiliency scale that they had created, a resiliency scale for children and adolescents. And my understanding is their longer term project is they are attempting to develop resiliency measures that span the, I guess, lifespan of the human. So the first one's for children, then this one's for young adults. I would assume that subsequent scales that they develop would be for adults, seniors, etc. So the introduction kind of covered the backdrop of the idea that they will be measuring, or I'm sorry, they will be developing a tool to measure resilience for young adults, but more specifically for college students, making that transition from the home life to the college life. They explain the different stressors associated and how those stressors can take a toll on emotional or mental well-being, which can lead to, at worst, academic failure or program non-completion. They define resilience. So they mentioned two main types of resilience. One is what I would characterize as trait-based resilience, and they mentioned this as personal resiliency. The short definition is the ability to overcome and thrive in the face of obstacles or adversity. Three keywords, obstacles/adversity, overcoming obstacles/adversity, thriving in the face of obstacles/adversity. The context here is adversity. And resilience is the ability to A, overcome adversity, B, thrive. So that is their definition. Different scholars have slightly or vastly different definitions of what resilience is. But that was their brief definition of resiliency. Now, they also go into a second definition of resilience, which I typically characterize as resilience is a process rather than resilience is a trait. So they define this as resilience as a dynamic developmental process or phenomenon that involves the interaction of personal attributes with environmental circumstances. So what are the keywords here? Developmental process, interaction of personal attributes with environmental circumstances. Now, these two definitions are quite similar. Now, I could be wrong, but let me read this through again. I'm sorry. Ability to overcome and thrive in the face of obstacles or adversity. Now, that ability implies the interaction of that ability with the obstacles or adversities. So in a sense, they are similar. But I guess the point that they're trying to make is it's more than just a personality characteristic. It's how that personality characteristic is emerges in the face of adversity, and what that process looks like of that interaction is, between that emergent characteristic and the obstacles or adversity or environment faced. Now they go into the rationale. The problem with prior existing research is they mention several theories attempt to define the different facets of resiliency. There's, according to them, there's no comprehensive theory yet. Previous studies limited by various shortcomings, methodological shortcomings, and in their generalizability, which I think is an interesting point to bring up in this article, because they are, I would question the same thing, how generalizable is resilience in young adult college students to the wider population of the entire world. There are a lot of assumptions being made here with college students. A, they can afford college. B, how adverse of an environment is college compared to other environments, such as individuals who are in the middle of war. So again, this question of generalizability is mentioned by the authors as a limitation to other studies, but also seems like a pretty notable limitation to this study as well. But anyway, moving on. So again, they mention a prior study that they did, resiliency scale for children and adolescents, and how they revised that scale for young adults. They go more into detail about the three-factor model of personal resiliency. Their idea of resilience is comprised of three separate factors: a sense of mastery, a sense of relatedness, and emotional reactivity. Sense of mastery itself is comprised of three sub-constructs: a feeling of mastery, perception of self-competence and self-efficacy. Sense of relatedness is comprised of four different constructs: sense of trust, perceived access to support, comfort with others, tolerance of others. Now I have a question, or maybe not a question, but I'm not entirely convinced with sense of relatedness. I think that sense of relatedness, and they admit this in the article, is a mediator of how resilient someone is. But someone who has a sense of trust in others and who believes that they have access to support or is comfortable or tolerant of others, I don't think that directly influences, and directly is the key word here, I don't think that directly influences their level of resilience. I think that it moderates their sense of mastery. Someone can feel like, oh, I have mastery over my environment. I am self-efficacious because I have access to this support. Or going over to emotional reactivity, And I'll come back to sense of relatedness real quick and how that mediates emotional reactivity. But the third factor that they mention is emotional reactivity, which is essentially how much crap they can take before they start to melt down. That's a very coarse summary of it. But do they say specifically here? Their threshold of tolerance. How quickly or how sensitive they are, how quickly they become emotionally upset, how sensitive they are, how long they're upset for, how much they're impaired by becoming upset. I do think that this is actually I agree with the researchers here, both with sense of mastery and emotional reactivity. I think both of these directly influence one's resilience. I don't think sense of relatedness does. I think that, again, sense of relatedness mediates the level of emotional reactivity that one might have. One might be take longer to get over their emotional upset if they also feel like they don't have access to support. One might be more tolerant of disappointment or adversity if they have, or if they feel like they have support. So in a roundabout way, I do agree that sense of relatedness affects resilience indirectly. I don't think it's has a direct connection with resilience. I think sense of relatedness goes through and affects mastery, goes through and affects emotional reactivity. And those two, at least for this study, considering this study, those two are what directly influences one's resilience. Anyway, it goes over, the article goes over the prior scale, the RSCA, how that scale was developed, how that scale was validated, and moving on from the RSCA, using that as the launchpad, I guess, to develop the RSYA. What they changed from the RSCA to the RSYA, so they changed around the wording of some questions because the RSCA was developed with children in mind, and they changed the wording with young adults in mind. They updated and added some items to adaptability. They added a bunch of different items, did some pilot tests, did an exploratory factor analysis, and again, reduced the number of items from 105 down to 50. So what they've done is, my understanding, the summary of what they've done is they've come up with a bunch of different questions intended to measure the 10 different subscales of mastery, relatedness, emotional reactivity. They took those questions that most consistently represented those respective subscales, and they cut the rest that weren't representative or consistently representative enough. What else did they do? They're moving on to the current study, following from the preceding scale development, and they want to confirm the factor structure of the 50-item RSYA. So basically what they did was, what this is saying is, they're saying, okay, in previous studies, what we did is we've come up with this pilot of the RSYA, where we have 3 different factors, 10 different subscales that measure the level, the prevalence of these 3 different factors in individuals. We cut it down from 105 items to 50 items. In those previous pilot studies, these 50 items were represented best by 10 subscales, 3 factors. That's what worked in the past with this group. That was the exploratory factor analysis. Now, what we're going to do with this study, we're going to get a completely different group. We're going to take our presupposition that this 3-factor 10 subscale approach works, and we're going to confirm whether it actually works or not with this different group with a confirmatory factor analysis. So again, they're saying they're replicating the factor structure found in previous studies. And then they are going to follow that up with an examination of convergent and discriminant validity. And basically, convergent validity is, let's say, we can reasonably defend the idea that, and that's questionable itself, whether or not one can reasonably defend the idea, but assuming that we can reasonably defend the idea that, in this case, they're saying that sense of mastery and relatedness correlates positively with well-being. So they're saying if someone has this good sense of mastery and someone has a good sense of relatedness, they should also have a good sense of well-being. And if they do, based on the rationale that we've set up, if they do, then we can also, if their sense of mastery and sense of relatedness correlate strongly to scores of their sense of well-being, and we expect it to, then we can say it has strong convergent validity because we expect it to and because it does. Now, on the other hand, let's say we think that emotional reactivity, when someone scores high on emotional reactivity, we assume, and again, whether or not this assumption or this rationale is correct is a different discussion, but assuming that our rationale is good, that we expect emotional reactivity to correlate negatively with well-being. So if someone has high emotional reactivity, we expect them to have negative or poor well-being. And if that turns out to be the case as we suspected, then we can say that our measure also has divergent or discriminant validity. I think, again, I'm just a student, could be wrong. I think that I'm not convinced because I think that resilience is different from well-being. I don't think that's enough. I think well-being, sure, is part of resilience. Are resilient people typically have better well-being? And I guess it depends on how well-being is defined, which they have not yet, which I'm hoping that they will in the next section. But do resilient people also have more well-being? Yes, but I think that people who, I don't know, it depends on how they define well-being. So I'm going to withhold judgment for now. So what we're going to do next, we're going to go through the method section. We're going to go through the research design, basically, their specific features. We finished the backdrop, we finished the history, we finished the prologue, building the rationale. Now we're going to go into their actual design of what they actually did this time around. So we're going to go through the methods, which covers the participants, their instruments, and I think this is where the instruments is where well-being and negative affect will be defined. Their analysis and their results. I will do my best to interpret these scales, but I think I will struggle pretty significantly. And then the discussion, which is basically like a more accessibly worded summary of their study and their results. And again, I'll do my best to translate each of these. Then they go into the limitations of their study, which I'm curious, and the implications. Okay, so we actually don't have too much more to go. Okay, so let's go through the method. Participants, 290 Canadian undergraduate students, 204 female, 86 males. Okay, so again, their sample is not that even. Between 17 and 27 years of age, or their mean age was 18.24. Wow. So that means that, let's see, standard deviation, so 1.51. So that means that 68% of their sample, 68% of 200, roughly 68% of 290 Canadian undergraduate students which they sampled were between the ages of 17 years old and 20 years old. So I do not think that this is a strong representative sample immediately. And then, so the minimum is 17, right? The standard mean is 18.24, standard 1.51. So that means like there, if you would, my visualization, if you would plot this in a distribution, that whole like, I would say a large majority of, 68 plus 16, right? 32, 68, 32, 32 divided by 2, 16, 16. But like 84% of their sample is between 17 and 20. So that only leaves 16. That's between like 21 and 27. That's just a very rough calculation. I could be wrong. Don't quote me on it. We created the student subject pool, which students receive credit for participating in improved studies. This goes to take a sample representative. How about generalizability? Create through student subject pool, students received credit for participating. Majority of the first students were in their first year of study. Here we go, 80, very close. I was close. I thought it was 68 plus 16 was 84%. Well, they're measuring second. Never mind. 89%, third year 1.7%, fourth year higher. Yeah, not surprised. Ethnic backgrounds, 4-year European through Asian. So again, this goes into the question of the generalizability of the study. Father's education, sure. Mother's education, sure. The sample tended to be younger. Their first year of college, predominantly female, European or Asian, from families who are well, again, this, and a lot of this is unavoidable. It's not like, I can't really tear into it, but again, this brings to question the generalizability of their own study, I think. Okay, now the instruments. In addition to the RSYA, other measures in the current study, trait emotional questionnaire short form, depression, anxiety, stress scales. Jeez, they got a lot of satisfaction with life scale, interesting. And flourishing. I've never heard of that. So we're gonna 1, 2, 3. I'm assuming these are how they are defining well-being. 2. It kind of bothers me that they're not consistent with their order. I wonder why that is. Depression, anxiety, and stress. 21 item. 4-point Likert scale. 0 to 3. coefficient alpha values. So this is how consistent the items in these different subscales were. So when it says depression, anxiety, and stress subscales had coefficient alpha values of 85 or 0.85, 0.78, 0.83, that means that, for example, if I was taking a depression subscale or a scale intended to measure my depression, it has a bunch of questions, right? Let's say 10 questions. My responses to those 10 questions, since those 10 questions are intending to measure the same thing, my pattern of responses should be consistent, right? If I am depressed and these questions are intending to measure depression, for each question, I should, to a consistent level, I should be responding that yes, I applied to me very much or most of the time, et cetera, et cetera. So when it says a coefficient value of 0.85, that means not just my responses, but whatever sample they took, let's say n equals 100 sample participants, their responses were consistently in the same direction, 0.85. I guess 85%. That's a terrible butchering of an explanation, but really it's the best that I can do without really thinking about it and writing it down and working through. But that is, I would say, pretty good. Hypothesize that depression, anxiety, stress would be significantly correlated with, well, they said negative affect. They didn't say depression, anxiety, and stress, and they didn't build the rationale. So question, I mean, oops. So their hypothesis was negative affect would be positively and significantly correlated with emotional reactivity. But they have not gone through explaining, maybe it's well known enough to not have to explain it, but there has been no, in the literature review and background, there is no mention that negative affect is depression, anxiety, and stress. Negative affect, personal variance, and negative emotions and poor self-concept. Subsumes a variety of negative emotions, including anger, contempt, disgust, guilt, fear, and nervousness. They're saying depression, anxiety, stress, contempt, anger. Yeah, it's not exactly the same. I mean, this is just something pulled off of Wikipedia, so not all-encompassing comprehensive, but just at a face level, it's pretty inconsistent. Let's look at flourishing. I'm assuming flourishing is how they measure well-being. 8-item measure, 7-point scale. Assesses self-perceived success in important areas such as relationships. Okay, so this seems to relate closely to sense of mastery and self-efficacy. Optimism, sure. 69.80. Validation studies confirm the scale correlates between 0.69 with other psychological well-being skills, thus providing a good assessment of overall. 0.69 is not great with well-being. In this study, the flourishing scale had a core, okay, that's good, 0.90. Hypothesize that flourishing would correlate positively with both protective aspects. Yes. Satisfaction in life. What's that one? 7-point scale. Response to five items. Satisfied with my life. Coefficient alpha and 0.9. That's good. What's the coefficient alpha? Okay, that's not bad. So far, all of these different measures they're using, it's questionable whether or not they're good comparisons, but they seem to be reliably measuring something, whether it is depression, whether it is a negative affect or well-being. At least in the sense of these scales, depression, anxiety, stress, they seem to be reliably measuring what this scale purports to measure. Same for flourishing, 0.90. So hypothesize that satisfaction with life would correlate positively. I don't know, I don't agree with this. Because one can be resilient, but not satisfied with their life. For example, let's say, it's a very crude example. Let's say I'm a euthanasia performer, and my job at the animal shelter, part of my job is killing animals. I could be unsatisfied with that, or for different reasons, I could be unsatisfied with my life, but I still could be resilient in my position in that environment. I still could be doing a good job. I think this goes with, I don't know. I think it's questionable. I'm not convinced with it, or with the relationship between satisfaction with life and resilience. I feel like someone who is satisfied with their life I don't know. I'll withhold my judgment for now. Is this one the Trait Emotional Intelligence Questionnaire short form? Trait Emotional Intelligence Questionnaire, 30 item. Trait of emotional intelligence. So what does emotional intelligence have to do with resilience? I think that's related to their factor of openness. I'm sorry, sense of relatableness or sense of relatedness. But again, what does emotional intelligence have to do with resilience? 150, okay, drawn from that 153. For this sample, size of EIs correlate. I don't know. I don't agree. I can't agree here. It's questionable. Okay. Just because they're correlated, though, does not mean that, I don't know. Just because they're correlated, if someone has a high sense of mastery, that may also imply, or how do I word this? If someone has high emotional intelligence, and if a group of people, if their level of emotional intelligence seems to correlate or be related to their level of sense of mastery, that does not mean that their emotional intelligence is directly related to their resilience, right? Because So for example, we're looking at emotional intelligence and we're looking at sense of mastery. We're saying that there is a strong correlation between emotional intelligence and mastery. Sure. But that relationship could still be mediated by another underlying or confounding construct, let's say socioeconomic status. If someone's rich, they in life, that's just an example, it's not a great example, but they may have been provided with opportunities to, they're not socioeconomic status, let's say family support from family. And again, this support from family, okay, I'm going to keep it simple. If someone has strong family support, that support throughout their life may have developed both their emotional intelligence and a sense of self-mastery or a sense of mastery. And that indirect, confounding, mediating construct or variable could be what is affecting both of those. And it might not be the case that EI is actually directly related to sense of mastery. I think it's hard to make a case that EI is. I think you would need to find other research that kind of proves that EI is actually related to sense of mastery. And again, that's part of why I'm not entirely convinced that. Sure, so what if EI and, or what was it? Satisfaction with life for EI is related to sense of mastery. It doesn't mean those things are also related to resilience. And if they are, they need to systematically explain rather how satisfaction with life and emotional intelligence are actually without a doubt excluding, ruling out other like confounding variables, how they're actually related to each other, not how it's not a fluke, or how there's not something else that's, tying it all together. Okay, moving on, analysis. Coefficient alphas were determined for the RSYA factor and subscales scores. Three-factor model described in the extensive writings of Prince Embury, and which formed the model for the RSCA and RSYA, was tested at the item and conducted CFAs with the 50 item. Okay. Conducted CFAs with the 50 items to ensure support for the 10 subscales, then conducted by CFA of the 10 subscales to, yes, further support the fit of the three-factor model. Mastery, sure. Pearson correlations were conducted to explain the relationships between the RSYA factor and subscale scores. Results. Ten subscale scores derived from 5 items. Oops. 5 items answered on a 5-point Likert scale. Score range of 0 through 20 for each. Okay. 3 major factor scores for the totals of subscale scores for that factor. Sense of mastery has 0 to 60 because, again, because there are 3 subscales. Sense of related 0 to 80 because there are 4 subscales. Emotional reactivity 0 to 60, again 3 subscales for a total of 10 subscales. Missing values were treated via multiple imputations using SPSS. Total amount of missing data comprised less than 5% of the total data. No patterns, okay. Frequency distribution. The support subscale was moderately negatively skewed. So moderately negatively skewed might look something like that. Recovery subscale was moderately positively skewed. So that would be like that. However, these were well within the range of acceptability and further. What was support in recovery? Support was in sense of relatedness. I think recovery was in emotional reactivity. Right? Sense of relatedness. Wait, it was down here. Where was it? Here it is. Sense of relatedness, trust, comfort with others, support, tolerance. Mastery was optimism, self-efficacy, adaptability, emotional reactivity, sensitivity, recovery, impairment. Okay. These are well within the range of acceptability. The 3-factor and 8 other subscales scores met criteria for the assumption of normality. Okay. Suggestion of normal distribution of scores for the RSY 3 factors and 10 subscales is consistent with the notion of personal resilience as normally distributed within both normative samples and clinical samples. Okay, so it's saying that historically we've shown, whether we as in Billy, historically we have shown, now we may be the researchers themselves. In this case, it does seem like they're referring to their previous work. Or it could be that prior excellent literature conducted or research conducted by other researchers supports the idea that personal resilience is normally distributed. So they're saying a rationale exists that says personal resilience is normally distributed. Our findings are consistent with that rationale or with that history or understanding. Now, I'm going to the reliability, then as we're looking at the reliability, we'll look at the table at the same time. Reliability, internal consistency reliabilities shown in table 1. Coefficient alphas between 0.89 and coefficient alpha values for the RSYA factor scores. So these are for the big 3 that they have. And then these, the rest of the 10, each of the, that make up the big, I don't want to say big 3, but the 3 factors. Coefficient factor 89192, so there's 899192. General, all subscale internal consistencies were adequate to good. The coefficient alpha rating, I mean, that's not terrible. Wait. All subscale internal consistencies were adequate to good. Okay, with the exception of tolerance. 0.65. Factor and subscale alphas. So what this is saying, what this 0.65 tolerance is saying is that although the questions were all intended to measure tolerance, the way that people responded implied people responded inconsistently, relatively inconsistently. So it brings into question how how reliably this tolerance is being measured, and B, whether or not it's actually measuring tolerance, or whether or not these questions are actually might be measuring a better measure of something else. Factor, but it's not that low. It's 0.65, which is, I guess, not great, but not like throw it out. Factor and subscale alphas remain the same or stronger than those for the earlier. Factor and subscale alphas remain the same or stronger than those for the earlier and longer RSCA. Okay. So they're saying that people people responded to questions about these different factors and about these different items, or about people responded to questions about construct in a consistent fashion. Meaning if someone was optimistic, they responded to our questions in a way that confirms their optimism. And by that understanding, we can say that our questions consistently actually measure optimism. Or, yeah. So let's look at mastery, 0.89, relatedness, 0.91, reactivity, 0.92. So basically, all this is saying is our questionnaire items are measuring what we designed them to, which is good. Our questionnaire items are consistent in their measurement. That's a better wording. Our questionnaire items are consistent in their measurement of whatever it is, mastery, relatedness, or reactivity. Now, the question remains, does mastery, relatedness, reactivity actually measure resilience? Or are those actually like factors associated with resilience? Okay, so let's go to the CFA. Factor structure was investigating this route. Assuming that's some type of software, confirmatory factor analysis software. Yes, okay. Maximum likelihood estimation. Utilized in all of the models. Okay. First set of CFAs conducted at the item level, which are entered as indicators without any parceling of items. Criteria for acceptable fit. Okay. Results supported both 10-factor subscale structure and a 3-factor structure. So results supported both 3 factors presented in table 2. So this is item level. So it's curious why they're using a 90% confidence interval. Typically, it's a 95% confidence interval. Root mean square of approximation. Okay, we'll go back to this. For the 10, okay. Fit indices of the 10 factors to reveal good fitting model. Factor structure also demonstrated reasonable fit with RMSE value of 0.8. Together, these results show that the similarity of the RSYA to the RSCA factor structure upon which it was modeled. So what this basically says is we confirmed that in our previous study developing the resiliency scale for children and young adults, we performed an exploratory factor analysis, and we found that a 3-factor structure, sense of items clustered into 3 groups, sense of mastery, sense of relatedness, emotional reactivity, best fit those items. Those items were best fit or best clustered or best organized into 3 groups. And items in each of these 3 groups were consistent with each other in measuring the same thing. Whatever it was, in this case, we're assuming it was actually sense of mastery, sense of relatedness, emotional reactivity. They all were similarly consistent in their measurements of those constructs. Now, in this study, we performed a confirmatory factor analysis using a new sample with young adults that show that indeed these items, these 50 items within these 10 subscales, these 10 subscales within these 3 factors, or that which shows that indeed the items are best grouped into 10 different subscales, and these 10 different subscales are best grouped into 3 different factors. Another series of CFA models were conducted using the subscale values, global models. 3 models were tested in this phase of the analysis. 1, 2, and 3 factor models, fit indices presented in table 3. One factor model was not supported. Although the 2-factor model suggested a reasonable fit, it was a 3-factor model that revealed the best. Okay, so basically they're saying, again, as previously described, or as previously proven in the RSCA study, this RSYA scale is also best described or best measured in 3 factors. Two-factor solution was examined high correlation between mastery and relatedness. Okay. Factor loadings of each subscale and the model tested are presented in figure 1, which we went over. Square boxes on the left of the figure represent each of the 10 facet scores. Here we go. The number represented on the arrows that point from the latent variables to the, figure 1. Oh, table 1, figure 1. Oh, here's figure 1. So these are all of the 10 different subscales. So optimism, adaptability, self-efficacy, trust, tolerance of others, comfort with others, perceptions of support, sensitivity, recovery. What was imp? Impairment. So it's saying here that optimism correlated, scores on optimism correlated, had a 0.82 correlation with the overall scores on all 3, I think. Let's read it. The square boxes on the left represent each of the 10 facet scores, yes. To the left of the facet scores are their error variances. Smaller factor loadings result in larger error variances are the portion of variance in each measure. Okay. So these are the residuals. The amount of variance in optimism that does not actually correlate with the amount of variance in mastery. The numbers represented on the arrows that point from the latent variables to the observed fast. These are the latent variables. These are the observed scores. So what this means is this construct of mastery, there is no test for mastery. They did not do a mastery test. The mastery test is the composite of the optimism, adaptability, and self-efficacy subtests. These 3 together make up mastery. We don't see scores of mastery. There are no scores of mastery. We can come up with an idea of what the mastery score is based on the scores of these 3. That's what this is saying. The numbers represented on the arrows that point from the latent variables to the observed facet scores are the standardized facet loadings. The arrows between the latent variables indicate the correlation between latent factors. So the correlation between mastery and sense of relatedness is 0.82. Okay. Divergent validity. RSYA factors and subscales correlated in the expected direction with other scales used in this study. Correlation coefficient shown on table 4. Protective factors, sense of mastery, sense of relatedness, and their respective subscales correlated moderately and positively with all of the psychological well-being measures. Replicating previous results with earlier versions of RSYA. And this doesn't mean that well-being or these different tests, this different battery of tests that they use, what was it? Emotional intelligence, flourishing, doesn't mean that those actually have much to do with resilience, or even much to do emotional intelligence. Has there been a proven, demonstrated demonstrated by an experiment link between, again, flourishing or emotional intelligence and mastery that rules out other potentially confounding variables like mother's education level or father's education level? They might have done this in this study, but we'll see. Youth with higher mastery and relatedness scores. But what does that have to do with resilience? Resilience is youth with higher mastery and relatedness scores reported greater satisfaction with life and psychological flourishing. That doesn't mean that they're more resilient, though. It just means that they're more satisfied with life and have higher emotional intelligence. As predicted, emotional reactivity factor and subscales correlated. Conversely, significant negative correlations, sure. So youth with lower sense of mastery are more likely to sure. Similarly, there was a significant negative relationship. These results are in line with those reported studies of the RSCA. Let's look at table 4. So, subscale of mastery correlated psychological. These are not like, what's SWLS? What was SWLS? Satisfaction with life. Oh, I'm an idiot. It's probably right here, right down here, satisfaction with life. Optimism, emotional intelligence. These aren't that strong anyways. Mastery with emotional intelligence, sure. I guess it's adaptability with, see, it's not. I'm just noting the exceptionally like small, or relatively at least comparatively small correlations. Oops. Let's limit it to the I guess it's um, unavoidable to an extent, where some of your correlations might be small. So stress, anxiety. So adaptability, if someone feels that they're adaptable, it might mean that they are slightly less stressed. But I feel like someone can be stressed and adaptable. Discussion. Again, this is a brief summary. RSYA, upward extension of the RSCA, including step in the author's longer term, yes. Better fit young adults. Shortening the scale and maintaining original 3-factor 10 subscale structure. 50 item RSYA. 41 of the original 64 items of the RSCA. 23 items eliminated. Or modified where 4 of the 10 subscales. New or modified items were included in 4 of the 10 subscales. Adaptability. New adaptability subscale deals with, addresses the usability to deal with major life changes. Optimism subscale includes items reflecting the view of oneself as a positive person. Modified support subscale. Okay, these are okay. Reliability analyses confirms that 3 factors into sensing a good level of internal consistency is found in the previous longer version of this scale. So this implies, first of all, that the previous longer version is actually measuring psychological resilience, because you can say my updated test, I cleaned up my test a bit, I changed the demographic from children to young adults. I cleaned it up. Now it's only 50 items. This test, we can prove that this test is just as consistent as this other test. But if the first test is not accurate, if it does not accurately measure what you intended to measure, and even if the tests are consistent, they are consistently wrong, right? Just because you have reliability of a measure does not imply that you also have that measure is also reliable or valid. You can consistently be measuring the wrong thing. Now the question remains, my question with this item or this questionnaire is not with the consistency. I think they've been relatively thorough in proving the consistency of this new measure to an older measure, or the consistency of this measure to the consistency with this measure and other measures that measures a broadly similar idea, loosely similar idea, but the question remains is it actually measuring psychological resilience? And that's why I'm still not convinced. I am convinced that it reliably measures something. It reliably measures optimism, self-efficacy, adaptability, that it reliably measures trust, support, comfort, tolerance, sensitivity, recovery, impairment. But I'm not convinced on the link to especially relatedness, the direct link of relatedness to psychological resilience. I think that they needed to include stronger rationale of why are these 3 different constructs encompassing of psychological resilience. And more importantly, if they are attempting to establish the validity of their instrument through convergent and divergent validity with other measures, they need to do an equally, if not better, job of building a rationale that, what was it? That emotional intelligence, this is why emotional intelligence is indirectly related, at least indirectly related to psychological resilience. This is why satisfaction with life is related to psychological resilience, because at the face level, I can't make that connection, because I know a lot, anecdotally, I could see someone being not satisfied with life, but still being a resilient individual, facing hardship after hardship. Maybe those hardships are why this person is not satisfied with life, but that in itself, I do not think implies that they aren't resilient. They may have been able to overcome these hardships and still not be overall satisfied with their life. These hardships could contribute to a low satisfaction in life, which is unrelated to their ability to overcome them. Same with emotional intelligence. Same with that general idea that well-being in itself is indirectly related to psychological resilience. I'm sure that there are plenty of, for example, this is maybe not a great example, it might be a convenient example to use, but I'm sure that, again, going back to the idea of war, I'm sure that there are soldiers out there who are very, very resilient in the face of adversity, significant life-threatening adversity, and they are resilient in those circumstances. And they have faced that challenge, they have adapted to that challenge, overcome that challenge, but they might not be satisfied with life. They might have low emotional intelligence. They might not feel as if they are psychologically flourishing. Just because someone is resilient, and I'm kind of charting into territory where I'm not too familiar, but let's say with the idea of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, these individuals at the time that they are facing significant adversity, they might be resilient. They might not feel as if their satisfaction with life is high, their emotional intelligence is high. Maybe that wasn't the greatest example. Let's nix that. Pretend you didn't hear me babble on about PTSD. Because PTSD, that I think that falls into the category of psychological resilience as an outcome, not necessarily as a process. And this article is about psychological resilience as a process. So let's not worry about PTSD. I think it is also related to psychological resilience. But again, PTSD is kind of like, my understanding of it is the aftermath of significant adversity, right? And this article is not talking about aftermath. This article is talking about in the moment, the process of resilience in interaction with significant adversity. And again, I know I've been like blabbering and droning on about this, but sure, this scale is reliable. But is it valid? Is this trust in others, this perceived support from others, does comfort with others or tolerance of others actually directly have anything to do with someone's ability to face and overcome adversity? I don't think that rationale was built strong enough in this article. I think that's my biggest criticism of this article, is that it might not be measuring psychological resilience. It might be measuring something. It might be measuring trust well. Might be measuring comfort well, but does trust and comfort actually, or does trust in others and comfort with others imply that someone's psychologically resilient? I don't think so. And I think that's the biggest, at least in my opinion, the biggest flaw with this instrument in its attempts to measure psychological resilience. But I'm going on and on. Let's go on. Let's go on. I'm just going to skip ahead because I want to see if they. I would love to see this actual. I'll look it up, but I want to see this actual measure. Confirms should maintain good to extent internal consistency, with the exception of the tolerance subscale. Where's tolerance? Oh, yeah, here. Yes. So this had the lowest internal consistency. Though minimally acceptable, the reasons for lower internal consistency of this subscale require. Okay. However, it is suspected that the low correlations between the item describing not holding grudges and other tolerance items will have lowered the reliability of the 5-item scale. It's only 5 items. And when there are less items, small differences can have a bigger impact on the overall reliability score. So for example, what's the difference between, on a 4-point scale, right? Let's say we have 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then let's say we have a 10-point scale, 1 to 10. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, 1 to 10, 10-point scale. The difference between a 3 and a 4, someone choosing a 3 and someone choosing a 4, is the equivalent of the difference between a 7.5 and a 10. That 1 point becomes 2.5 points worth of difference when you increase the number of items. So small item scale, when there's only 5 questions, variation in the responses that you get, my understanding is, has a bigger impact on the overall reliability, or has like, it swings, a heavier swing on how it influences the overall reliability. The extent of which this is unique to the sampler age group. Okay, CFA. Supporting over 100 item level, subscale level. Support for the 3-factor structure was comparable with that of the earlier longer versions, sure. However, 2 factors also supports the view, sure. Additional work with the RSYA will allow for combining these factors in the creation of resource and vulnerability indices available for the pre-usage screening. Convergent discriminant validity. This is my biggest problem here. This is what I was yammering on about. Support for convergent and discriminant validity are provided using various measures of well-being or emotional distress, sense of mastery factor, optimism subscale, strongly related to self-reported flourishing and subjective well-being. Findings are consistent with the research associated. What does this mean? Findings are consistent with the research literature associated with the positive psychology of the movement spearheaded by Martin Seligman. So sure, of course, you can say that our optimism subscale was related to responses in flourishing subscale, and that the flourishing subscale combined to establish what we call well-being. But again, the question is not addressed. Someone can still be resilient, in my opinion, psychologically resilient, and have a low sense of well-being or a low sense of flourishing. I don't think these two have a strong connection to psychological resilience. Furthermore, previous studies in the sense of mastery factor have shown in yeah, sure, grade point average. Okay, so saying oh wait, this was a good one, but also question. So previous studies of the sense of mastery factor have shown it to be correlated with such variables as grade point average and successful completion of freshman year. Yeah, but you're not comparing it to what like connection have you made with GPA and resilience and GPA and successful completion of freshman year? Sense of mastery, I have no doubt one's sense of mastery, one's feelings that they have, that they are self-efficacious, that they can adapt, has a correlation with GPA and success. If one feels that they have mastery over a subject or over the semester, it's likely that they feel that sense of mastery for a reason, because they are succeeding. But again, how is that? I don't see the strength of that relationship to overall psychological resilience. Strong positive correlation, sense of relatedness, flourishing, subjective well-being. Relatedness may facilitate transitioning to the unfamiliar university environment by allowing them to quickly form new relationships, connect and feel comfortable in their new social environment. Okay, I think I've went over my skepticism with relatedness enough, so I'll skip it. Both sense of mastery and sense of relatedness factors and their subscales correlate highly with emotional intelligence. These findings suggest that although not the same, there is significant between emotional resilience. Yeah, but you're admitting they're not the same. So how can you establish convergent validity of psychological resilience when you're admitting emotional intelligence are not the same as sense of mastery and sense of relatedness? Additional research can explore how these variables compare. So this, to me, this doesn't seem to be a measure of psychological resilience. It seems to be a measure of student performance. Let's read it here. Psych. Oh, I'm an idiot. I can just add text. Look at that. That's my biggest gripe with this one. Okay, I'm done. Emotional reactivity factor. Let's color code these. No. Emotional reactivity factor subscale strongly correlated with all three measures of negative affect. And again, the question is, are these three measures actually measures of even negative affect? I don't know, but I question that. Similar subscales. Students who scored higher on are more likely to experience negative emotions, compromise their functioning as students. I think this is my biggest, to sum up my problem with this scale. Is this a measure of psychological resilience or a measure of student performance? Limitation. The RSYA is a self-report measure and does not assess actual resiliency in youth. There we go. Additional research will be needed to support predictive validity. Although concepts addressed by the RSYA are supported by previous theory and research, the RSYA does not purport to assess all aspects of personal resiliency in all situations. Similarly, three-factor model underlying the RSYA is presented as an understandable and clinically practical model used along with other methods of assessing personal resiliency. Although a focus of our current research is on post-secondary student success, the current study is limited to using samples of college students. Additional predictive validity studies should examine the relationship between these constructs of personal resilience and outcomes for a diverse group of young adults. Sure. Having established the goals for the development of the RSA, the next steps would include acquiring larger, wider samples of young adults. Okay. Implications. Significance of this work builds on the original intentions of the RSCA. Rationalize the construct of personal resiliency for practical application. The model graphically displayed above suggests a simplification of personal resiliency to three developmentally grounded constructs, broken down to yes. Support for the three-factor model. It's consistent with the original intent to provide a potential means for assessing personal resiliency across the age group longitudinally across lifespan. Much additional work needs to be done to achieve the above goal. No potential conflicts of interest, no financial support for the research of this article. The resiliency scale for young adults may be obtained from the Pearson assessments, which holds copyrights to the RSYA. Let's see if I can find it. That was the article. Again, I think I've laid out all of my criticisms. I don't have a criticism with, I think that the article did a good job of being thorough with how it established its reliability, whether it's internal reliability of the items or the subscales, whether it's the reliability or the correlation of the different subscales to each other, or the different subscales to the constructs, different subscales to each other, the different constructs to each other. I don't think the reliability study is the issue in this article. I think this article has an issue with its validity study. I'm not convinced that I am convinced that this is probably a reliable measure of optimism, of adaptability, of self-efficacy. I'm convinced that these three um, comprise mastery. I'm not convinced that their convergent and discriminant validity study had anything to actually had much ado about actual psychological resilience. I think that this was a test to measure student performance way more than it actually measures the psychological resilience of anyone. They made a very loose link that psychological resilience is related to student performance, which I'm sure it is. I don't doubt that. But I don't think that the other skills that they used, whether it's, what was it, satisfaction with life, emotional intelligence, flourishing, specifically those three. I don't think that those three would actually have a strong relationship with the broader construct of psychological resilience. So I think by extension, it's questionable to say, because scores on our tests were consistent with scores on these other measures, that our test measures psychological resilience, because I think those other tests actually are less indicative of psychological resilience than your current test. What would I have done differently? I think that I think that this relatedness should be cut. I think mastery and reactivity are more universally would be more of a predictive factor. I'm sorry, let me reword this. I think this mastery and reactivity factors would be far better, far stronger predictors of psychological resilience than I think that relatedness would be as a direct predictor of psychological resilience. So I would cut relatedness. Here's what I think it would look like. Dang, there's no space to draw anything. What a shame. Here's what I think it would look like. It would look like this. You have sense of mastery. You have emotional reactivity. We have psychological resilience, right? Boom, boom, right? So this would be a negative correlation. This would be a positive correlation. Now, what's mediating these levels? As in, what's a factor that may influence increased feelings of sense of mastery or decreased feelings of emotional reactivity? I think that's relatedness. I think it is related to, or I think relatedness is indirectly related to resilience, but I think it goes through like this. Would I add anything else to psychological resilience? I'm working through this right now because I'm also working on a project to develop a measure of psychological resilience. So if I were to create my own measure based on this study, based on some other studies that I've read, I would take out relatedness. I would keep emotional reactivity. I think that's probably the strongest one. I think sense of mastery has to do with resilience. Um, what are some other ideas that we can think of that might be related to how resilient one is in the face of adversity, in their ability to face adversity, in their ability to overcome adversity? So what ideas are related to? First, let's think about facing adversity, that interaction of stepping up to adversity. Confidence, right? Confidence is part of sense of mastery. Maybe sense of coherence. I think that's part of self-efficacy, though. Confidence, sense of coherence. Maybe awareness, but that's awareness of this idea of pragmatism, awareness of knowing where one stands in the face of adversity, being able to know the odds of success or failure, and being able to make good decisions. What would that be? And is that actually related to one's overall resilience? So let's say I am faced with resilience and I have to adapt to resilience, or faced with adversity and I have to adapt to adversity. I think maybe knowledge, awareness. I think that has a lot to do with it, because if you don't have and that might be under self-efficacy or sense of mastery, actually. But the idea is that if you're faced with adversity and you know um, that you can overcome it, then you'll be much more likely to face it. And how do you know that you can overcome it? If you have I'm getting way off track, and this video is probably way too long. So let's end it. Let's look at the resiliency scale for young adults. Praying, there's a nope. Let's see if I can find it. If I can't find it, I'm just gonna end this because we're done here. I'm gonna do a part 3 where the last thing that I need to do is fill out this data sheet. And this data sheet is basically my informed opinion about how, there we go, about how sound this instrument is. So we're going to go over the name, source, their definition of resilience, what constructs they mention, all of this stuff. I think it's a process here. Format measure, self-report, sample items. That's what I'm looking for. Because there weren't any sample items in the actual evidence rating. Let's look at evidence rating. I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, anyways, I'm really need to get a grip on this. I need to look for this scale. Oh, let's take a look. The resiliency scale for young adults revisited. All right, I think I'm not going to waste any more time hemming and hawing over trying to find the scale while I'm recording. If I can't find it, then I will include it in the next video. If you've watched this, which I doubt anyone has, but if you have, I hope it was somewhat entertaining and educational. Again, I'm not a professional, I'm just a student, and these are just my thoughts as I grapple through the text. Hope to do more of these in the future and basically document my entire journey working with resilience. I might do one of myself as I develop my own skill, or start to develop my own skill. Yeah, so thank you, and see everyone again soon. Bye bye.